Hi, this is Giovanna Cano from the Online News Association at the University of South Florida, St. Petersburg, and I'm here at ACES 2019 in Providence, Rhode Island, and I'm speaking with Steve Aime. He is an assistant professor at Northern Kentucky University and has worked as a copy editor and journalist for Fox Sports and the Baltimore Sun. I really wanted to make your session yesterday, but unfortunately I was assigned another task. So I'd like to touch on that a little bit. I know you were here presenting conversations about diversity and inclusion with editors of color. Could you tell me a little bit about that?
It's an interesting experience, which is why the Diversity and Inclusion Committee wanted to set aside some time to have a conversation. And the group that was organizing it asked me to moderate, and we were able to get it done. As a person of color who worked in journalism and now teaches journalism, we've made a lot of progress in diversity, a little less so in inclusion, and I think it's important to have these types of conversations where people can share experiences and folks can hear from one another. I'm hoping as the conference continues for more years, I would love to sit on sessions for disability journalists, for non-binary journalists, so I can hear more experiences as well.
Yeah, I think that's really important, especially now in our society and how open we've become to accepting all sorts of diversities and inclusions. I wanted to bring up that last year there was a study released by the University of Central Florida under the Institute of Diversity and Ethics that reported all the sports editor outlets.
Oh, the Lapchick study.
Yeah, the grades. And it was noted that ESPN received an overall A, while the Associated Press sports editors received a D. And there was an overall little change in inclusion and diversity in sports coverage between all outlets. Could you tell me a little bit how your experience as a ex-sports journalist, what would your perspective be on that, and could you elaborate?
It's interesting. You did some research.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, you're coached very well by your teacher.
Thank you.
You should be proud. The Lapchick report, now when I talk to my students, I always tell them to watch out for what we call the ESPN effect. You'll see a ton of diversity on ESPN, gender diversity, racial diversity, again, non-binary diversity. But that's not what you see on local news. When you see local sports talk radio, small-town newspapers, they are often lacking in gender diversity and in racial diversity, unless, for sports talk radio, the person is an athlete of color. But you can go into bigger cities and you won't see journalists of color on like sports talk. So that's something to work on. And I think we touched on it a little bit in yesterday's session. People have to really think about their newsrooms and are they inclusive? Do people want to stay there? All right, you can bring somebody in, but can you get them to stay? Do you have a culture that is responsive to different needs? I remember sitting in a session, we're looking to expand our academic diversity. Somebody said, how many of you know where the local mosque is, and the local Hindu temple, and the Jewish synagogue? And you start seeing a lot of people doing one of these, and then they say, well, if you're a black person, do you know where you would get your hair cut? Or a black woman, where do you get your hair done? And again, people started scratching their heads, and you begin to see you can have some talent and get a job, but then is the place responsive and hospitable to diverse people? I think within sports journalism, I think a lot of it is going to be region, and I think a lot of it is going to also be the sheer will of newsrooms. Do they want to go and build bridges toward underrepresented groups, whether that be women, racial minorities, non-heterosexual people?
I think it's interesting that you bring up women because I also noted that you were a co-writer on a journal. In 2016, there was a study done called the Diversifying the Sports Department and Covering Women's Sports, a survey of sports editors, 2017, my correction.
It came out in 2016, and then it officially went into the journal in 2017. So you're correct twice.
Okay. Yeah, I was like looking at my numbers here. But it was interesting because in the survey, there was 128 editors surveyed, and out of 128, there was only 6 women. And then out of all the editors surveyed, 34% of them said that they recalled no women in the sports newsroom. So that's reflective of what you just said about the lack of people actually being involved with diverse inclusion in the newsroom. Like, we don't have enough of that. And I wanted to ask you, how can we get more women in the newsroom, and where does this start?
This is interesting. So my primary research is race and gender portrayals in news and sports media. So if we're looking at attracting women, we have to say, well, why aren't they the desirable audience base? So if you ask people, whether it's ESPN or it's going to be Sports Talk or it's going to be whatever, we're looking for men 18 to 45. And you're like, okay. And then you look at FS1, Fox Sports 1, you look at NBC Sports and CBS Sports, and you look at Golf Channel and other things, and you're like, yeah, men 18 to 45. And you're like, well, there's a big segment of the population that you've ignored. If you want to get more women, it isn't more women to do a masculine activity, right? You have to look at it in a very holistic perspective. Okay, when we talk about our linguistic choices, right? So like I love basketball, right? That's a man-sized rebound, and you're like, okay, what happens if you're a big woman, you go grab the rebound in a very powerful manner? You don't say that's a woman-sized rebound, or LeBron James is the man. Well, what's the corollary for women? So there are like things organizationally to talk about. I think when you look at access to resources, how many brand new stadiums are built for softball, women's soccer, but you'll spend a lot of money for football teams that lose a lot of games and basketball teams that lose a lot of games. The Miami Marlins, I mean, they lose all the time, and they got a stadium. Perhaps maybe we could have invested in women's sports, right? You look at the U.S. women's soccer having to sue because they can't get equal pay even though they win. They get better ratings than the men. They can't even play on grass. And you're like, well, if you treat something second class, then the audience and the people working in the industry will begin to treat it second class. UFC has done, I think, they were a slow adopter to women fighting in MMA, but I see women headlining a lot of pay-per-views and their ESPN Plus events. So I think they're doing a good job there. You look at some of the video games. So a lot of younger people grew up learning about sports through NBA 2K and MLB The Show and everything else. Well, FIFA put women in there a couple of years ago. The NBA 2K put the WNBA in. Now, if you're a 6-year-old girl and you buy the FIFA cover and you see Alex Morgan on the cover, oh, well, that's pretty cool. Like, I want to play soccer. But then you have to invest, right, in the new facilities and other things and give them comparable TV time.
Yeah, I think what you're saying there is representation. Representation does matter.
Mm-hmm.
And I wanted to kind of divert towards a statistic that I found that I personally, as a student, have noticed myself in the classrooms. I found I think this was also mentioned in the journal, that 66% of journalism graduates are women. However, mass communications are women. However, there are less of them represented in the field.
Correct.
What would your opinion be on that?
It's a twofold situation. So we have mass comm. So a lot of women are represented in public relations, but not so much in journalism. I tend to look at a lot of things through a structural lens. If the job was designed by men, journalism has been historically a male-dominated field, then it stands to reason that the rules and norms built into journalism were built for a male workforce. It doesn't work for everyone, right? When you look at issues in Silicon Valley, and you're like, well, where's the gender diversity in Silicon Valley? Women can program too, they're smart. Work styles are different, communication styles are different, family responsibilities are different. I learned a lot from a former colleague of mine who's working in government, and she said, yeah, I had a kid, so I would do all my work between 7 and 4. But then the other people were working between 10 and 8, and then thought I was not doing any work because they visibly did not see me do work. Well, okay, that's a structural issue. Then you have this variable nature of journalism. Some days it goes 8 to 8, 8 to 10. The way structurally a lot of U.S. society is that women are the primary caregivers if you have a family. Well, who are you calling then if you're covering a beat or there's a fire or there's a shooting or there's triple overtime game or somebody gets traded? You've got to go. Sometimes you got to jump right on the airplane and go. And we've cut so much staff that we're expecting reporters and editors to do more and more work. There's not enough backups and stuff like that. It's an industry that is not, in my opinion, the most friendly industry for lifestyle. And then you take its male dominated legacy and history, and it becomes a very inhospitable place for a lot of women.
I think that you have a good point when you say that it's not a friendly lifestyle. In the discussion between diversity and inclusion, what would you say is the difference between the two? Because there's controversy on how to define diversity and inclusion, and there's different opinions on what each word really represents. But there's no doubt that the lack of diversity is a result of bias. How do you feel about that?
That's interesting. Diversity is just a count, right? I need 10 women. I need 5 black people. I need 2 Muslims. I need 2 non-heterosexual people, right? I am diverse. Inclusion means that these people are stakeholders and influencers in your process, right? That what you do every day is you're looking to include people who are not generally included in decision making and in creating values. Circling back, if we're talking about women in sports, this AAF football league might go bankrupt. It got way more coverage in a month than the women's soccer league got all season, and is bankrupt. is going to go bankrupt. If you're going to be inclusive, you have to make an investment in changing your process or modifying your thought outlook. And to be uncomfortable, we talked about that yesterday. I think Elena did a nice job of talking about that. That it's okay to be uncomfortable because it's change. You can't be inclusive if you're not changing. You have to cede your privilege and your power to then open space for somebody different, some new thought. If everything is always the same, then you're going to get the same outcome. I mentioned yesterday, one of my mentors, he's been proven right as we've gone along. He says if you have bad outcomes, you have a bad process. And so if you have a bad process, it probably means that you're not inclusive. You can be diverse, but if you're not having an inclusive leadership team, you're not telling your employees, okay, you need to make sure that everybody feels valued, that your hiring practices and your story decisions are reflecting a wider perspective than just your neighborhood, then you're going to be inclusive. With the internet today, I can find people, but that doesn't mean I can't keep them in my company, retain them, develop them, and promote them. Because like that is key. When you get a chance, I'll throw this out if there are any academics listening. This is a good study idea. Spoiler alert. When you see people get fired and they mention who are potential replacements, go see the types of people who are always mentioned for taking over a job or for doing something. You might be very surprised that it's usually one group of people. Means then that there's a flawed process if we have so much talent, but only a select group of people get to be mentioned to be COO, CEO, CFO, to be running a sports league or to be in charge of different things. Go look at USA Soccer when the men's team shamed themselves and didn't make the World Cup and they bounced out the head of USA Soccer. Why wouldn't you hire a woman to run USA Soccer since their team clearly is way more successful? They must know something. But very few women, until some players complain, were even mentioned to lead. And they still didn't pick a woman to lead.
Yeah, that provides a lot of great insight into this field, especially with your background in sports journalism. With such a diverse subject and topic that we're touching on a lot of different aspects of society, what are some strategies that could be used in changing the status quo?
The best people I know in this industry always look to reinvent themselves. They're never stagnant. You have to be always looking at what's next. You have to, at times, look backward to see what did we do and how do we improve the process. But then the best people will look at what's next. If you do the same things over and over, you're not going to get anything new. If you're looking at stories and you're like, whose story isn't being told? That you're going to find something. You're going to find something because that group which had no interest in reading or watching or listening to you because you ignored them, you didn't care, now will be like, oh, that person may not be that bad. That outlet may not be that bad. And you have to be willing to take criticism. I mean, I think some editors and some mentors go too far. I think with now the track changes. It used to be red pen. Now it's the track changes. But you have to take criticism from the community. Constructive, not like you're going to stand there and get pilloried by people. But, hey, when you wrote this story, did you think about this group? When you did this, why did you make that decision? Because we disagree with that. It's not that this job is a fight to be right. You're working as best as you can to tell the best stories you can, the fairest stories, and ask questions that people are not asking. Why is it on a Fortune 500 list that you don't see that many women? You've got to ask that question. It means you have to go and ask things like that, right? If in the NFL, the league is 70% black or a racial minority, and you have so few coaches who are racial minorities and team executives, you have to ask questions. So where's the mentorship coming from? Go ask the other coaches, how did you become a coach? And then where did these other people go, right? The person who's asking questions to stuff that seems common sense or obvious, this is the person who's going to go the furthest. Because nothing is because it's common sense. It's because there's some mechanism behind it. And so somebody has to really ask these questions. But you can't think of yourself as above criticism in this business. You are always subject to being critiqued, and that's okay.